Welcome to this beautiful step-by-step wildflowers tutorial. I discovered a surprising technique to make painting foreground flowers so much easier. Let's get started. For step one, I'm going to paint the sky, the distant trees and the fields wet in wet. I'm starting off with a puddle of cerulean and a pinch of Winsor red. It's a very grey sky, but I wanted to add a little bit of colour. So I'm wetting the sky with plenty of water right down to the foreground area where you've got the fence, and really allow that water to soak into the paper and take your time, because that will give you more time. And just to say, I'm using cold press 300 grams watercolour paper on a block, and I've sketched out the outline with an HB pencil, and I've used washi tape around the border. I'm loading my flat brush there and painting at the top of the sky, wet in wet. Really enjoy this process. Just apply puddles of paint because we're going to be tilting. So we're going to really get this paint moving now. So I'm just tilting towards me, allowing it all to run down and then to the side. And you can see you get these lovely atmospheric, quite unpredictable effects because we're really painting wet into wet here. And I'm going to collect any excess puddles with a clean damp brush at the edge here. So using my size 12 round brush, I'm just adding a little bit more of this cobalt blue with a pinch of the Winsor red here and there in the middle of the sky and at the top, and again tilting. I felt it was just a bit too pale, and you can just use your own judgment to see what looks good and then stop. Remember, in watercolour, less is more, and do collect those puddles as well. So I'm going to paint the distant trees now, starting off with a little bit of lemon yellow and ultramarine. So you want more blue than yellow. So I'm just trying to get the right mix here. So it's about 80% blue, 20% yellow. I'm also using a little bit of the cobalt blue with the Winsor red, sort of mixing it together so it's really pale. And I'm going to work to start off with wet into wet, just to get the overall sort of shape here. And I'm using my size 4 round brush, so I don't introduce too much paint, it doesn't run into the sky. So just painting the tree here to the right, and just again painting wet into wet with this beautiful grey colour. And you may want to experiment with mixing that colour. One thing you don't want is it to be too sort of green. You want it to be cool and pale. I will be adding more details to these trees wet on dry later in this tutorial, so try not to overwork them. I'm mixing up some Viridian with a little bit of lemon yellow. If you don't have Viridian, you can use any green, and if you don't have a green, you could use phthalo or Prussian blue. And I'm painting this sort of mid-green, more damp into damp now in front of those trees. So this is the sort of middle distant field here. I've rinsed my brush, taken the excess water off, and I'm just softening that hard edge there with my size 8 round brush. And I'm going to allow my painting to dry. Once the painting is dry, for step 2, I'm going to paint the foreground flowers wet into wet. I'm using lavender and wisteria. They're colours by Daniel Smith. Now, if you don't have these colours, don't worry. You could mix permanent rose with the cobalt blue and add a pinch of white watercolour or white gouache. So I've mixed them together there, and I'm wetting the foreground now with plenty of clean water using my flat 1-inch brush. You can use any large brush. I'm painting damp into wet. Using my size 10 round brush, I'm just painting sort of dots in the foreground, using the tip of the brush and allowing the paint to spread because the surface is wet, creating their own natural sort of edge, which is quite effective. So make these larger in the foreground and get smaller as you go further into the painting there. And take your time, try to sort of space them out. If I was to be critical of my process here, I probably got carried away painting too many flowers. Remember, in watercolour, as I said earlier, less really is more, but it was so much fun to do. And I'm kind of varying my colours here as well. I'm using a little bit more of the wisteria wisteria on its own and painting smaller marks here and there. Again, remember, if you don't have this colour, you could actually use permanent rose or another pink and add a little bit of white gouache. It's quite an opaque pastel looking shade, but I thought it's perfect for this painting. So I'm adding a little bit more water here because I'm having a little spatter. Couldn't resist. You may want to cover your sky area so you don't get any pink or lavender spots in the sky. And I'm using my paper towel just to lift off a few of the marks here and there. I did get a little bit carried away, so it actually lifted off quite nicely, as you can see. So I'm just doing a little bit more of that, adding some more of the lavender with the wisteria mix and having a little bit more of a spatter here and there. So a second go, just to try and get some smaller marks around the fence area because it is a little bit further away. And I've decided to allow my painting to dry before I get too carried away. Step 3, I'm going to mask out the flowers with masking fluid, and this is part of my little discovery. Usually I'd mask out the white of the paper and paint the flowers afterwards. This way I found it so much easier and it looked so much more effective, which you will see later on in this tutorial. So I'm applying the masking fluid with a stencil brush, and I've actually dipped it into liquid soap to protect the brush while I'm using the masking fluid. If you don't have a stencil brush, don't worry, just use an old brush and you can use a stippling technique to apply the masking fluid. So I'm dipping it into the masking fluid. I'm actually stippling on my painting board there just to get some texture, and I'm stippling over the marks that I made earlier that are completely dry to create texture, especially around the edge marks there. I've also spattered some of the masking fluid around the bottom of the fence to create smaller marks, and I'm going to allow the masking fluid to dry naturally. In step 4, I'm going to paint the foreground grasses wet into wet, damp into wet and damp into damp. Starting off with the lemon yellow, I'm going to put a pinch of red in that wash. So it's a lovely warm colour. Now using some of the lemon yellow with a pinch of the Viridian for a light limey green colour. Mix up plenty of paint. And now wetting the foreground grass area here with plenty of water using my 1-inch flat brush. I'm starting off with the yellow with a pinch of red colour. So it's a very sort of yellow orange painting, wet into wet. And I looked at the photograph, you can see this sort of golden colour here and there. So I'm starting off with the lightest washes. So using that limey green now, painting wet into wet here and there, using the tip of the brush, creating small and larger marks. And I'm tilting here to get the paint to mix and flow. Mixing up some more Viridian now with the lemon yellow, slightly thicker, slightly stronger in colour here. And I'm using my size 4 brush, still painting pretty much wet into wet here and there, but sort of creating this variety of greens now, slightly stronger in tonal value. And keeping everything really random as well, really focusing on that photograph to try and give the look of those stems and leaves. Mixing up a little bit more of the Viridian now, and I've added a touch of quinacridone gold. You could use raw sienna, slightly creamier. So we're now painting damp into wet. We're using my size 4 brush, just building up these colours now slowly. It's so much fun to do, and it's great to practice those techniques of wet into wet, damp into wet and damp into damp. So as you can see here, I'm just keeping everything quite random, but bigger marks in the foreground, smaller marks as the leaves and stems go further away. Adding some more of that quinacridone gold now, so it's a lovely golden sort of earthy green, and just sort of painting that damp into damp in the sort of middle of that area there, and just using the tip of the brush as well, sort of pressing down, lifting up so you get those thinner sort of ends of the leaves there as well. As you can see, turning your painting sideways or even upside down can be so useful. I'm using a rigger here. You can use a liner brush or just a small brush, and I've added ultramarine with quinacridone gold. As you can see, there's not a lot of water in there, so this is quite creamy paint, and I'm painting damp into damp now, so the surface isn't as wet. I'm just painting these really sort of thin sort of leaves and stems, mixing up some phthalo blue now. You can use turquoise or Prussian blue with burnt sienna to make a lovely dark green, painting this damp into damp with my rigger, just letting the brush dance on the damp surface there. Adding a pinch more ultramarine to make that green darker and creamier, and painting damp into damp with the rigger these lovely dark marks here and there. Remember, bigger in the foreground, smaller as it goes further away, and that really does create depth in your painting. I'm using a plastic card now to lift off the damp paint. If the paint runs back in on itself, it's too wet, so just wait a little bit longer. But it creates these lovely thin long grasses and stems, really effective, and try to vary the marks that you make. So I'm mixing up here some of the lemon yellow with a pinch of the Viridian, so it's very much a yellow green. Using the rigger, I'm just painting smaller yellow green grasses around the bottom of the fence here and there. Mixed up some Payne's grey and quinacridone gold with a pinch of the ultramarine, so it's a really dark creamy colour, and I'm painting this damp into damp with the rigger in the foreground here and there, just really being mindful not to put too many darks. I've got lots of light and mid-tones. I really want to concentrate on the darks and the details here. I'm masking out the sky and the distant trees with a paper towel, and I'm using Hansa Yellow Deep. You can use cadmium yellow mixed with a little bit of Winsor red, or any red will do, and I'm spattering with my rigger brush, but you could use a small round brush. I'm just spattering these lovely sort of yellow flowers that you can see in the photograph here and there. I'm also stippling with the rigger there to create some slightly bigger dots just to finish off this stage, and I'm going to allow my painting to dry once more. For step 5, I'm going to paint some more details on the distant trees, paint the fences and some flowers around the fences. So I've mixed up here a little bit of ultramarine with some of the lavender. You could use a little bit of ultramarine with a pinch of burnt sienna. Very watered down, painting the tree trunk here with my size 4 brush, wet on dry. I'm just getting a little bit of the green there, the dark green, watered down, using the belly of the brush to create a slightly dry brush effect with this very light green, and just creating some details here just to add some texture without bringing the trees forward. Adding a little bit more of that very pale blue green, just using the tip of my brush as well. When you use the belly of the brush, you get a little bit more texture, and that shows especially if you're using cold press or rough watercolor paper. So I'm adding a few sort of branches here using that same color because it's a very misty pale blue green. So just using the tip of the brush just to add some details here and there. I'm painting the fence post now, and I'm mixing up ultramarine with burnt sienna. About 50-50, quite a light wash to begin with, wet on dry, using my size 4 round brush. I did have a pinch of lavender in there as well. I was using some leftover paint, so it's got a lovely pastel look to the paint. If you want to get that effect, just add a pinch of white paint. So I've added more ultramarine to the wash, and I'm just painting a little bit more of a darker colour to the right hand side, telling myself the light is coming from the left, just to introduce some shadows there. I'm adding a pinch more ultramarine here, damp into damp, underneath there to show some shadows here as well. And then using that sort of blue-grey colour, painting wet on dry to paint the wire for the fences, using a sort of a stippling effect there. So broken lines, and I'll add some thicker lines to give the look of the wire there. You could actually use your pen to do this like you do for line and wash. It could be quite effective, especially with this detail here. Adding a little bit more ultramarine with a pinch of burnt sienna and painting damp into damp, a touch more shadow to the right hand side of this fence post. And I'm using my plastic card to lift off and create light and textures here as well. Mixing up a creamy ultramarine and burnt sienna mix here and just adding a few more darks and details on this post, damp into damp. So painting the fence post to the left here, wet on dry with my size 4 brush with about 50-50 ultramarine and burnt sienna with a pinch of that lavender. And I'm going to paint some darks on the right hand side of this post and create some texture using the plastic card, and then paint the other posts with the wire as well. And as the smaller posts go further away to the left, I will make them lighter in tonal value so they recede and it creates depth in my painting. If it helps at all, you can turn your painting to the side to paint. Sometimes it's just easier to sort of see things with a different eye, adding this sort of detail on the wiring, sort of wet on dry, using the tip of my size 4 brush, using the mix of the ultramarine and burnt sienna. I would say about 75% ultramarine and about 25% burnt sienna. I've decided to add a few more sort of longer stems to go over some of the sort of fence area here, adding a little bit more detail as well in the sort of middle of the foreground here. I'm using a light yellow green, so it's about 80% yellow with about 20% viridian. It's just to add a touch of detail here and there. I'm going to paint some of the flowers around the fence here using some of the lavender. Remember, you could use cobalt blue with permanent rose. So I'm using my size 4 brush and just painting underneath the sort of flower here, adding a touch more cobalt blue as well to darken up the colour. Working damp into damp, adding some of the wisteria as well in the middle of the flower just to build up some of the details here and there. So I've made this flower bigger to stand out more, and as you can see, it is actually in the photograph as well, standing out. So I'm adding another flower to the right of it here using the same sort of colours, and then some smaller flowers here along the fence line, just using the tip of my brush, not too much detail, but using the cobalt blue, the lavender and the wisteria. Just a few more little finishing touches there. And I'm going to allow my painting to dry. For step 6, which is my final stage, I'm removing all of the masking fluid and I'm going to paint the flowers. So I'm using a paper towel to remove this. Make sure your painting is completely dry for 2 reasons. One is you could tear the paper, and 2 is you could smudge your paint onto the lovely light flowers. My surprising discovery here was that the flowers looked so beautiful. I could have left them like this, but I thought I'd just add a little bit of darks and details here and there, not painting all of the flowers. Some of them I'm just going to leave light, but others I'm just going to concentrate, especially the larger ones, with adding a little bit of the lavender, a touch of the cobalt blue, just sort of halfway down and sort of at the bottom of each of those blooms there, just to bring them to life. So I'm using my size 4 brush, starting out with each bloom wet on dry and then painting damp into damp, sort of more darker sort of shadow colours using the cobalt blue and a pinch of Payne's grey. I've just added a little bit of white to this light green colour, and that's the lemon yellow with some viridian. I'm using the rigger and I'm just painting some lighter grasses here and there, especially around the bottom of the fence there. Just to add these lights and details really can bring your painting to life. So I'm getting to that sort of finishing part of my painting, so I don't want to overwork it. So I'm just adding a few more of these lighter grasses in the foreground, just here and there, and a few more lights as well on the wildflowers here, using white with a pinch of pink. Any pink will do. And it's just these lights and details that help finish our painting. So remember again, less is more. So I'm painting in stems now using my rigger, using a mid to dark green. You can use the ultramarine mixed with the quinacridone gold, just varying my brush marks here and there. Going for a mid green now, so I'm using the lemon yellow with the viridian and just sort of painting sort of the grasses there in the center. So just adding a few more marks. and adding a few more darks here and there on some of the stars of the show to bring these flowers to life. I'm actually using a ready-made violet, painting damp into damp with the rigger. And it's just to add a few more final touches here and there. It's really hard sometimes knowing when to stop. I get that question asked a lot. Sometimes it's a good idea just to walk away and come back either a couple of hours later or the next day. And sometimes you'll think, actually, I have finished, and you could have actually overworked your painting. So here is the finished painting. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you'd like to support the content that I create here on YouTube, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? You will get access to my weekly exclusive tutorials and downloadable outline sketches, and you can cancel anytime. Thank you so much for watching this tutorial. Happy painting. Bye for now.